This is the Startup Society's Foundation podcast. I am joined today by another Joe by the name of Quirk, the head sea evangelist over at the Seasteading Institute. Mr. Quirk, how do you do today?
It's great to be talking to you, Joe, and you are an inspiration.
Well, thank you. That's incredibly flattering. I think likewise, and what you're doing is incredible. And to people who don't know what seasteading is, can you just give a brief overview of what seasteading is?
So seasteading is building politically independent cities that float on the ocean. And once you realize that half the Earth's surface is unclaimed by any country, seasteads would be startup countries on the blue frontier. So we could create as many startup societies as we want if we can get seasteads started.
Interesting. So there's a lot of claims that seasteading has a lot of technical hurdles to overcome. You know, being on the ocean, having to deal with storms. What are some of the largest technical obstacles that seasteadings have, and how do we avoid them or address them?
Well, what's funny is that waves, tsunamis, pirates, all the things that people think are problems are not problems, because giant floating cities are possible right now. The challenge is making it cost effective. So why would anybody but a fossil fuel company or a cruise ship line build one? And how do you convince an investor this is a valuable idea? So the technical challenges are doable. It's all a matter of making it affordable. How do you establish a business model? What's the competitive advantage? And that's why we're getting started in French Polynesia, so we can set up the minimal viable product in shallow waters using existing technologies and make it affordable for a normal, middle-class person from the West.
Excellent. So, and that sort of ties into my next question. How does the startup society or the entrepreneurial mindset sort of tie into building new societies?
Well, 3,500 people have already filled out our survey specifying what they want from these floating societies. So we're in the early adopter stage, where many of these people are of all different income brackets, but many of them are entrepreneurs. They're eager to hire, and many of them want to do the ultimate entrepreneurship, which is what I call aquapreneurship, which is not just starting a business within an existing system, but starting an existing system from the ground up, or in this case, the water up. So a lot of people that reach out to us are aquaculture farmers who want to, get beyond, 20th century regulations and spur 21st century rules. A lot of fish farmers, and just once you propose that we could have a technology for you to found your own startup society, people come to you with their own ideas.
Interesting. Has anyone thought or is currently implementing sort of like a blue technology tech accelerator?
I don't think the same way that we plan to. I mean, I think after our presidential signing with the president of French Polynesia, we hosted like a laboratory, like a tech accelerator laboratory. And like all these wave generation companies and nanotech companies and all these people showed up to propose their business and their technology because they wanted to be on this accelerator. So I think one of the things that's attractive about the first floating island project is that you'd bring all these people to one place. And get kind of network effects. A precedent for this, I would consider Blue Seed. So Blue Seed tried to, park a boat just off Silicon Valley to allow people to get around the HB21 visa or whatever it's called.
Yes.
And you'd think most of the people that would sign up to live on it would be, Pakistani or foreigners who want to work in Silicon Valley. But interestingly, 60% of the companies that said, yes, I want to be on that ship were American. Wow. And the question is, well, what do they get out of it? And they are already in the United States. Some of them are already in Silicon Valley. but they're attracted to the idea of being in this kind of floating dormitory where there's lots of other people like themselves and they're all working together. So that Blue Seat hasn't got it started, but I think that's an example of how just the sheer opportunity to put other people like you on the cutting edge of blue tech all in one place is enough to attract people.
I think you're absolutely right, Joe. Some of the best parts about a city, in fact, the key element of a city is high density that leads to ideas mingling together and synthesizing together. So that's absolutely right. And I think it's very interesting that you're choosing French Polynesia, especially because they already have a history of this. In fact, I think it's been argued in a couple of articles about you guys that French Polynesia, they're like proto seasteaders. How does their history sort of inform how seasteading will be in the future?
Well, you know, when you're a seasteader, people look at you like you're crazy. But every Polynesian I met during the 10 days I was there, either from government ministers to little kids, you explain seasteading and they're like nodding. They're like, okay, islands, autonomy, choice, I love it. So when do we start? And I literally did not find one exception to that. It's in their culture. It's in their blood. So I think of Polynesians as the original seasteaders. They, you know, starting like 3000 BC, they started moving from island to island and it kind of founding little startup societies and discovering them. And this spurred an evolutionary process that created a very special kind of culture that is all their own. And on these giant voyaging canoes, they would load up whole families and animals and be out of sight of land for weeks at a time. They would just be living on these things. And it's being commemorated in the new movie Maona. I recommend people check this movie out. It's beautiful. And just as Westerners moved west on the American frontier and created all these new societies that changed the world, Polynesians have been moving east on the blue frontier, and they created something very unique, found nowhere else in the world. When I visited, for a seasteader, it feels like coming home. So they already have an intuitive sense that this is interesting. So it's an ideal place to get started.
That's beautiful. And you keep reiterating the concept of choice and sort of like exiting other systems or the West. You know, if they didn't like their currently existing system, they can move elsewhere. The beautiful thing about seasteading is that it's almost baked into the cake, the ability to leave. You could simply float away. Do you see seasteading as a form of secession, or sort of secession is built into the model?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I call it secession. You know, I remember when Obama was winning elections, and Texans I knew were saying they've always wanted to secede, and they wanted to secede even more. And Californians were saying they were crazy. And now all of a sudden, with the ascendancy of Trump, Californians are saying they want to secede.
Yeah, who's laughing now?
Yeah. So, and why shouldn't they all get what they want? And instead of having to win an argument, what I love about seasteading on this sort of fluid frontier is that it allows people to disassemble and move around and choose their neighbors. And that kind of breaks up the monopoly of governance and allows people to choose new societies. It's almost like you almost don't even need the word secession, because you're just in a dynamic society. Like, I don't need to secede from Starbucks. I don't need the word. I just walk across the street and go choose Pete's.
It's implied. It's like it's an opt-in system, not an opt-out system.
Yes. And yeah, so it's beyond secession. It's kind of like if you're, it's that old joke about fish. Like, someone asks them about water and they say, "What's water?" I'd like to see a world where children of the future, it's like, well, are you going to secede from your society? And they're saying, well, what's secession? I live in a society that's dynamic and people move around and choose the kind of governance they want.
Interesting. So something that kind of parallels that more on information tech level is blockchain technology. They have the ability to set up a framework for trustless information disbursement, and there's ways to split it based on how they want to govern. Like the Ethereum blockchain, they split based on governing principles, and right now Bitcoin is thinking of doing a hard fork basing off of principles. Do you see blockchain sort of helping seasteads govern themselves?
I think yes, because seasteads will be founded, in the very near future, in the 21st century, and people starting them will all be looking for all the best ways to resolve disputes, record transactions and contracts and pay each other, and they'll most likely adopt the most modern and efficient processes. And I think you and I are interested in the decentralization of power over these things. And nobody says, I'm going to secede from Bitcoin. There's just a better option if it emerges, and they'll choose it. So it's funny, but I like to say there's two places we go where we describe seasteading and people don't act like we're crazy. One of them is French Polynesia, and the other is a Bitcoin or blockchain conference. We show up there and people say, "Oh, you're the seasteading guys. We love you," because they get it. They get the kind of principle of sort of decentralized choice, proliferating the solutions available to people.
So if I was going to take a more realist stance, however, sympathetic yet realist, blockchain and floating away as a form of opting out, that's beautiful for a domestic governance. However, one of the biggest problems of governance is sovereignty or negotiating autonomy with other states. How does seasteading sort of ensure its own sovereignty?
Well, I think it's going to be slow, incremental steps, and I can imagine how it would go. So, Kiribati is in danger of being completely sunk by the end of this century if trends continue. I can imagine them slowly transitioning into being a floating country. There's lots of shallow waters in that area where even if Kiribati sinks, there'll be lots of mountains that come up to within 50 meters of the surface that you can sort of attach your seastead to. So if one of these nations sort of slowly transitions into being a floating nation, will they be recognized as sovereign by the nations of the world? I think they will.
Interesting.
Now suppose somebody else builds one right next door in more international waters. These little mountain ranges that come up very close to the surface in warm, nice waters are very common on the ocean. And the UN has a pretty amazing record of recognizing the autonomy of indigenous people. So what happens when children are born on some of these floating platforms in places where states don't currently exist? Should they be stateless? I actually know lawyers who are eager to argue exactly this point on the UN floor. So it's not just a technological innovation. It's not just a technological frontier. It's a legal frontier.
Right.
If a new island suddenly emerges on the ocean, people can go out and claim it, and it will most likely be recognized as sovereign after going through the proper channels with regard to other nations. Suppose people build their own island. What's the legal what's the legal position then? I think we can steadily transition into having recognition for seasteads.
So that's an interesting perspective, and I think potentially one of the methods is sort of having a host nation, like what you're doing with French Polynesia. I know that Liechtenstein, it's always had a host nation of some sort. Right now, it's Switzerland. Do you in China, in Hong Kong, they have the China is their host country. It used to be Britain, and they have some sort of semblance of protection. At the same time, they have autonomy. Do you think it's best to sort of have a host nation at first, and then as you grow in power and economic prowess, you'll be able to reach out a little bit further?
Yes, there are numerous reasons to start with a host nation. And a big one is that the jump to the high seas is too expensive.
Right.
And all the shallow territorial protected waters are controlled by existing governments. And we want to provide the minimal viable product for floating startup societies. So what do we need? We need to float, and we need any measure of political autonomy. So if you want to convince an investor to invest in your new society, you want to provide the minimal amount of risk. You want the first baby step towards autonomy. And Tom W. Bell, who legal innovator, you and I are both fans of.
Oh yeah.
He's taking the best practices of 4,500 special economic zones around the world and applying them for modular floating seasteads in what he calls sea zones. And so if we can get one of those negotiated in territorial waters, we kind of remove the risk from our host country. You don't even need their land. You'll bring your own land, and if you fail, your bankrupt island will disassemble and float away at no cost to the host nation. And if you succeed, you create prosperity for your host nation, and you can attach more platforms and expand your floating city. And then if French Polynesians approve of what you've created so far, we hope to negotiate for the next step in legal evolution towards more autonomy on the high seas. And Tom W. Bell already has ideas for what he calls the deep blue zone, which would be an area of international high seas created within the waters of French Polynesia. So you can see how we'd advance. This is legal evolution advancing in parallel with engineering evolution onto independence on the high seas, and each baby step being a profitable business model. So at no point are you saying, let's just build $1 billion floating city, get people to invest in it, and take a huge risk. It's much better to scale these things up slowly, and preferably all over the world, than it is to take one big leap and ask everybody to adopt an expensive risk.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the same principle applies to starting countries as it does startups. And I'm wondering, we keep talking about the word startup society, and maybe it's better for you to elucidate, what is a startup society in your mind? What's important for a startup society? And what's a good example of a startup society that you want seasteads to aspire to?
Wow. I mean, there's so many examples. And I'm going to try to give one that maybe won't be the first one you would come up with, because I immediately think of Venice. So Venice was really, 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years ago.
Yes.
It started in a swamp because there was so much violence from existing states. People couldn't even live on the land, and they fled out to a swamp, and they found 118 little islands, not even islands, underneath the water. And so they built civilization on stilts. And the only thing they had going for them was it was basically a startup society, and it was close to the sea. And so it was a bunch of kind of pioneering people who got to start over. And the success of Venice was extraordinary. It dominated the Mediterranean, for like 1,000 years. It attracted commerce. It was the gateway between the East and the West, and Byzantium and all these other places. And it became much more powerful than the rest of Italy for a very long time. And if they can build that, 1,000 years ago, imagine what we could do today if we could proliferate startup city-states. And I also think it's very symbolic that they found that waterways were better than roads.
So I love that example for so many reasons. For one, the conference that we first met at in Crete, it had a Venetian harbor to start with. Second, it's crazy that there was an actual example of seasteading that long ago. And three, the creation of Venice mirrors the political situation now. We're having a moment of balkanization and a little bit of chaos and uncertainty. And what happened out of that was the creation of these new startup cities like Venice. So I think that's a perfect example and way to aspire to. So we, for the structure of this interview, we sort of said that you would ask me a couple of questions and you'd ask me. So do you have any questions you want to ask me, Mr. Quirk?
I certainly do. I want to, first of all, I want to know what crowdsource is.
Maybe we could talk about it another time, but if you want me to go into it, sure. So I initially, when I moved from electoral politics and policy after I got very fed up with the ineffectiveness and the immorality or vicefulness of it, I wanted to change the world through technology and through entrepreneurship. And the first thing that came to mind was Bitcoin and microfinance. So basically, we tried to create a platform in which people would invest with cryptocurrencies in small businesses in order to get a share of profits over a given period of time. It was like a good way to invest in companies that were too small to sell equity, but were too big to take on loans.
So I'm curious about your evolution toward caring about this so much, because I recently listened to that barn burner of a speech you gave at the startup foundation. I think I spoke at it too remotely.
Yes.
And I could, you could really hear how driven and inspired you were to make this happen. And you made a really kind of radical assertion I want you to expound upon, which is that if we can outcompete like all the services of an existing state, if you can provide them better, then that aspect of the state will simply go away. And I'd love to hear you elaborate on that or give specific examples.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I gave it a different term at the time. I considered like a version of white agorism. Agorism being counter economics or using the market to outcompete the existing system, and white meaning doing it in a legal way, not in an illegal way. But now I've moved over to a term which I call exitarian. And an exitarian simply believes that a political system is better if it allows you to opt out and choose others. Mm-hmm. And competition is the key point there. If you can provide a better service, the previous model becomes irrelevant. And the best proponent of this was a man named Buckminster Fuller, who you are very familiar with, who has a quote that says, "You don't change things in the existing system. You create an alternative so that make a better alternative to make the other one obsolete." Mm-hmm. And sort of the logic of that is that a system has its own momentum and it has its own incentives to maintain itself. So any change will be marginal at best and require a lot of effort if any change can be made at all. Versus if you have some new experimental thing like a startup, you don't have that sort of inner bureaucracy. Everything is new and what they call in the startup scene lean, so that they're able to make changes or pivots and address concerns that established systems cannot. And with technology increasing at a rate, the cost of starting these new institutions is increasingly low. And at that point, even if the existing state of things constantly tries to squash any competition, it'll be sort of like a hydra. You cut off one head and another one pops up. So at a certain point, if everyone keeps trying to, like outpace the existing state of things in education or in healthcare or in welfare or in politics generally, there's no way that they can compete with it. Right now, we're providing such a bad service, it's almost easy to outbeat them.
Well, how does the bad service go away by providing a much, much better service if it's the state that it has this monopoly on force?
Well, because if a state isn't really just establishment of force, it's also the implicit consent of the governed. if you don't have not just the obedience of those that are governed, but also the love and the acceptance and the view of justice, then it won't last very long. If everyone stopped voting today, for instance, which is often seen as the big legitimizing force within Western governance today, it probably wouldn't last longer than a year if everyone refused to vote.
Mm-hmm.
So if you show legitimacy from other sources outside the state loses its one core element that keeps it in check. And once that's gone, it's game over.
Yeah, like I'm thinking of say like Dale Brown, the Detroit Threat Management Center.
Yes.
So I see that he's providing a better service than the police. So for people who are listening, Detroit got so bad the police publicly gave up on large tracts of it. Crime was running rampant. This guy Dale Brown, starting with a dog and a shotgun, just started providing security services for people, providing escorts into their homes, escorts into their business. Before you know it, private people are paying him to provide security. He's been doing this for 20 years, and no one who has ever contacted him for help has ever been harmed. It's profitable, and it's hugely successful. So as Dale Brown brings civil society back to Detroit, say over time, why wouldn't Detroit police simply reassert sovereignty over that city and provide that kind of, you know what I'm asking?
Absolutely, just like quash it. But here's the thing: they would lose legitimacy. They wouldn't gain sovereignty. Sovereignty is the idea of legitimacy, and if you just quash something that people have been respecting for so long, it's just going to cause more antagonism. It's just going to accelerate the process. It's in psychology, you kind of realize this, that people accept things more when there's a benefit out of it versus a punishment. And if the governing state is providing benefit, then they'll rather accept it. But if they're trying to assert their sovereignty through punishment and through force after someone tried providing you a good, it's just going to become ridiculous. And another example of this is in Venezuela. At the Startup Societies Foundation, we actually have an employee who, up until recently, was living in Venezuela. He recently escaped. But instead of using Boliviars, they've been using Bitcoin, but they've even been using weird cryptocurrencies like rare pepes. I'm not even joking. You can look this up. Wow. And it's completely destroyed their sense of legitimacy, because if in a modern economy and state, the biggest source of justification is the money. And if the money is toilet paper, and if you're using something as ridiculous as a meme on a blockchain, it completely destroys all sense of worth for that state.
Now that I can see. If the world spontaneously switches to a kind of cryptocurrency that the state has trouble taxing, I can see that putting it out of business. I don't know if that's possible.
So, and here's a more pertinent example of the United States, something that's a little less radical, but impacts our life every single day, and it's FedEx. It's a completely legal organization. It seems kind of banal, but basically it's strangled the post office, and it's things like FedEx are strangling the post office now. And now no one's asking for more funding for the post office. They're basically just waiting for it to die. And that's because of that. You found that they provided a much better service at a much more quality price.
So that's the key. That's the key thing I'm trying to get at. So do you think the post office will go away because people don't like it anymore?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, no one's going to lobby for the post office anymore except for post office employees, because they haven't really gotten any benefit out of it. But people might lobby to protect FedEx, because of that's how they get their packages at Christmas. They don't use the post office for that. The only reason that it still kind of exists is because there's a monopoly on like letters.
Yeah. And I'm curious, I'm very curious about Venezuela. Like what percentage of people, what percentage of people are using cryptocurrencies?
I don't know the exact number. I can bring that up for you, or I can. In fact, it might be interesting to interview Guillermo, who's the employee at some point. I think he would have a lot of interesting things to say on this topic.
Yeah, because I mean, the concern is that these old states systems just keep limping along, because once they're in place, it's just very hard to make them go away. Corn subsidies don't go away. The post office is still here, even though everyone uses email. I mean, if email couldn't make my junk mail go away in my mailbox. So I'm just curious as to.
So it might be better to start in places where they don't have this infrastructure already. I'm sure you're familiar with this concept, but maybe the viewers wouldn't be. The idea of leapfrogging. It's harder to adopt a new system if you already have an expensive system that you've already paid for that's already established, even if it's subpar. Like, for instance, the United States has this energy infrastructure that has been made for fossil fuels. And it's really hard to make sustainable energy effective because of this. But because of it's already there and it's really expensive to make new infrastructure, it's just more cost effective to maintain it. However, in Africa, they can leapfrog straight to sustainable energy, and they don't have that problem. And I think it's the same with startup societies. I'm more skeptical about having a startup society or to have these new systems in places where there's already an established system that's not the worst. The best places where this exitarian ideal is going to take place is in a place that there's really nothing. And that's kind of the beautiful thing about seasteading, is that there's largely nothing on the oceans.
Right. Yeah, and this is leading me straight to what I was so curious about, is that how you came to Startup Societies as the Startup Societies Foundation as an alternative. Like, how would these be blank slates where you could start over?
How did I come up with the concept of startup societies? Well, I think it's just sort of the logical conclusion of all these concepts of opting out and creating new systems. But unfortunately, with blockchain and with these other sort of exitarian institutions, they need a place where they're sovereign. That's the key element. If they can't be free to experiment, they can still hack away at the existing system, but it's much harder. Like, for instance, my startup Crowdsource. The reason why it didn't go farther is because of the SEC has ungodly amount of regulation on that topic, so much so that no one's willing to touch it. Even though it would, provide autonomy and economic livelihood for many people who would use the platform, they weren't able to because they didn't have sovereignty of experimentation at a certain place. And what startup societies allows you to do is that you can have these many platforms for sovereignty. So even like when blockchain people, they talk about, we don't need a military, or we don't need sovereignty with blockchain, just everything can be done through the blockchain. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, contracts are often dealt with violence, and violence is often the purview of the state. So what we need is to find a geographic area where we can control that.
It's so tragic what you just said, that Crowdsource. I mean, you think it could be flourishing now if you could do this in a different place. And like, so you've personally experienced over regulation?
Yes. So I applied to a lot of accelerators, and that was the consistent thing that we kept getting back, is like, sorry, we can't touch it. It's just too much of a legal gray zone. It's just not worth it. I mean, in the entire time, the biggest cost, it wasn't development. It was legal fees. And honestly, I'm coming across that problem now. I mean, I've been advising for this one startup called Axor, which is sort of like a decentralized way to make financial markets that can long and short, or like peg to any existing security, and you can decide to long or short that existing security by going into a financial pool. It's a little bit complicated, but either way, it's a beautiful idea, and basically can allow anyone to kind of invest in any financial security in the world from a smartphone. But because of the regulations, it's just not going to happen. And the biggest cost associated with that project is not development, it's legal fees. And they're afraid of moving forward unless they have seed money just for the legal fees. They're willing to code it on themselves, but it's ridiculous.
And I think being in Silicon Valley, and it's amazing how many entrepreneurs like you tell stories like this, that paying lawyers legal fees and the onerous cost of regulations, many of which don't apply to the new innovation they're bringing, will prevent investors from getting involved because it's too expensive, it's too risky, there's too many unknowns, there's too many contradictory rules, and they don't know which one will be pulled out. They have to pay lawyers just to analyze exactly what you do. And as someone who's kind of starting his own startup now, I've learned that lawyers in general can't even give you a straight answer. They have to say well, there's this interpretation, there's that interpretation. We don't know how it's going to go. You just have to sort of forge forward in a state of complete unknowns, whereas there's this Kafka-esque series of contradictions that can be pulled out and used against you.
I mean, even in the best case scenario, law is always interpretation. I mean, that's kind of the basis of common law. And that was one of the big problems that happened with the Slockit DAO, if you're familiar, the decentralized autonomous organization. For the viewers, it's sort of like a way in which the blockchain Ethereum could create sort of an incorporation based on crypto tokens, and it was hacked. And according to the hacker, it was actually 100% legal. and it just needs some sort of interpretation. And so it needs a place and it needs enforcers. It can't just all be blockchain. And go ahead.
Well, the skeptics will always say if you just create a place where people have more freedom, then they'll have more freedom to do really bad things.
So I'm sympathetic to that idea. I'm not a libertarian anymore. I'm an exitarian. I don't believe that we should have no rules or even a small state across the board. I think the important thing is to allow people to choose within different systems. And then that competition creates better government. Now, some would believe or predict that better government that would happen through competition would be smaller government. But I'm open to the possibility that there are certain rules that would develop. I don't want there to be bad people taking advantage of good people, innocent people. And I think that the best way to allow that to happen is experimentation and exiting, not necessarily just saying across the board, we're gonna completely change the laws of this entire nation state. So, that's another thing that ties into exitarianism. It doesn't believe in an ideological framework that goes across everywhere. It believes in experimentation. Even if it's something libertarian, I would not be for completely across the board United States completely destroying its regulatory, fiscal, and tax framework. That would lead to chaos. And that's what the Chinese model is. Instead of completely reforming after the Cultural Revolution, they allow these many micro experiments to happen. And then they sort of had a gradual change that allowed for a little less chaos. And lo and behold, though, it does sort of tend towards free markets and property rights. Right. So perhaps that's the best method rather than just carte blanche saying, okay, we'll just destroy the state.
And it's silly because that's not going to happen anyway. And any sudden collapse of a system is going to be terrible.
Right. But so I think that you just said that, and it reminds me of exactly why I started this. I started this because I want to change the system, but I don't want to cause violence. And there's three ways to change the system. This route, exiting the system. Voting, which is perpetuating a lot of violence. Like if you're voting for a system, you're implicitly supporting war and whatnot. And the other way of change is revolution. And I don't like either of those options. And I thought, well, if the only options are perpetuating existing system that's violent or destroying the existing system through violence, the only other option is to create something and have creation be destructive.
Hear, hear. Creation setting better examples. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's about increasing the choice that everybody has to choose different systems and increasing the incentives of these different systems to compete for people's choices. And people need rules to get along. That's the nature of civil society, is that there's implicit or explicit rules that people agree upon so they can do business together.
Yes.
And the problem is always a monopoly. I don't want a monopoly on coffee. You don't want to give me a monopoly on book writing, because my books will get worse and worse and more expensive all the time. And we're in a situation now where we have a monopoly on the most important thing of all, which is the creator of rules. Yes. And the enforcer of rules. And it's inconceivable the amount of innovation and prosperity that could be unleashed if the foundation of society is not a monopoly. If there are more choices for people to switch among, and then these different groups can interact with each other. And it doesn't have to be based on this, old nation state system. So more choices for more people, especially people from dysfunctional governments, give people in Venezuela and Honduras a better choices, and watch as solutions emerge.
Joe, I can't imagine ending on a better note than that, to be honest. But Mr. Quirk, it's been an absolute pleasure. Everyone, this is the Startup Society's Foundation podcast. Tune in for wonderful content like this. Joe, I know you're going to do wonderful things in the future, and I can't wait to see you in future history books.
And thanks for persuading me to become an exitist live on this podcast.
Oh, excellent. Have a good one, Mr. Quirk.
Thanks, Joe.